What's up, Movement Masters? Shawn, Myszka, Movement Mastery, and OptimizeMovement.com coming to you with another movement lesson. And this is actually part 2 of our summary in regards to my presentations on perfect practice, or my ideas and thoughts of perfect practice that I was giving or offering for the crowd at the coaches conference for the National Strength and Conditioning Association. Here in part 2, we're going to discuss a number of the reoccurring questions that arose from participants that I tackled after the sessions. Thus, I wanted to explore a few of them for you here now so I could package them in ways so everyone could hear them. The first question that I heard on a number of cases was, how do we impact the 3 B's of movement skill? The brain, the behaviors, and the biomechanics. And what do I really mean when I talk about the impact and the influence of each? Well, I'm talking here in regards to the formation in the organization of the biodynamic structure, the movement solution to the problem being presented to the athlete. The biomechanics do not just emerge out of nowhere. It's always going to be due to a combination of an athlete's intention at the brain, the attention of their behaviors, and then the calibration of the biomechanics. Essentially, anytime we see an athlete movement sport, they are going to be a culmination of all past experiences that they've ever had. And what we can see is their current interpretation of the solution that can best solve that problem in respect to who they are at that moment. So the coordination and the control of an emergent movement pattern is what we are attempting to optimize with each and every passing rep. And thus, in my opinion, we must include an attempt to impact as many aspects as possible at each of those levels that we mentioned earlier: brain, behaviors, biomechanics. Because remember here that what we are after is mastery of movement and ownership of that movement in sport for the athlete. So our activities that we prescribe aren't just about repeating perfect biomechanics rep after rep. Instead, it's about allowing the athletes the opportunity to master themselves and their movement in the respective problems. The biomechanics now may be what we see as the output, but it's not always mechanisms or deficiencies at that motor level that are responsible for that given output. It could be what an athlete is thinking at the brain level, or how they are interpreting the problem that is leading to that given solution that they come up with. Or it could be what that athlete is feeling and sensing at a behavioral level that is leading to the positions and the patterns that they employ. And those are things that can be impacted along with the biomechanics by changing our approach to our activity and practice design and our communication to the athlete with our instructions and our feedback. A second question that I often heard was, how do we go about designing drills and knowing when to change aspects of the drills? Well, first of all, let's remember we should look at drills as activities for motor learning in most cases, rather than simply looking at them as drills. I know this seems like purely semantics, and I don't want to get caught up in that. However, what I do want to do is to get you really thinking about this. Remember, all experiences will influence what behavior emerges later on, especially under factors like anxiety, pressure, chaos, or fatigue that can all act as either performance influencers or performance inhibitors. Thus, we simply must prepare athletes for that and use those things as times or as litmus tests, if you will, to test the athlete's action responses and then to tease out certain errors so the athlete can learn from it even more. And that's just it. Any traditional drill per se can be modified accordingly to become an activity for learning if you know what to look for and what to modify. Now, I showed some people in the lobby of the hotel after the session how I would go about changing some of our traditional drills, such as those that many coaches often employ, like a traditional 5-10-5 drill or a pro agility drill, and how I would do just that, how I would change some factors of it. And that's the thing. We all need to watch more sport movement and truly attempt to understand it at a multi-level of analysis to determine how it's being coordinated and controlled, constructed, and organized. And only then can we begin to figure out how we should best try to develop that movement skill in training and practice environments. Thus, when you start seeing an athlete gaining understanding based on the current problem that they are facing, I suggest you change the nature of the problem, whether it's the actual goal of the activity, or through explicit instruction that you give them, or through your cueing or feedback. All of these things act as constraints and will serve to either limit or allow for certain movement behaviors to emerge. And by doing this, you will see how the biodynamic structure of the movement skill then changes and how the athlete is likely to behave when the time comes in sport. So in my view, if movement skill acquisition motor learning is the goal of your session, each session should be developed to help allow that athlete to continue to gain mastery under the ever-changing conditions of their sport. Depending on the level of movement mastery the athlete has, this would determine to what extent you will change the activity as well as probably how you will go about doing so. And that's where a further understanding of the dynamical systems theory and the constraints-led approach would really start to come into play. The third question that I got was, during the hands-on, how come I didn't make more adjustments to the athlete's technical display or technical execution? Well, let's remember that obviously my drill progression was attempting to take two athlete volunteers from a base level all the way up through the steps of skill acquisition to the point where they could use it in sport. And as I mentioned at the onset of the hands-on session, the 40 minutes that I was allotted was not going to be enough to tackle all of the things in the typical fashion that I usually would. You know, many people pointed out the variability in posture or the variability in instability that athletes showed, kind of getting off balance at certain times. And those people wondered why I didn't point some of these things out, either to the athletes or to the group. And it's not that we don't or I don't look to make local changes to the technical execution. In fact, I believe that being able to adequately evaluate technique is one of the most important skills that movement coaches can and should have. However, in my opinion, we must determine a few things that were beyond the scope of the given presentation or even of this short video. First, what really is optimal technique? Second, what issues were causing it, or what issues were causing the technique or contributing to the technique? Third, what would be causing and or contributing to that given technique or problem that we saw within it, such as the balance issues or the postural issues or whatever it may be. Additionally, let's remember here that these guys, these two gentlemen that so graciously volunteered out of a group of 100 to 200 of their peers. Now, this in and of itself creates a ton of pressure and anxiety in lots of people who wanted to evaluate them. And again, this in and of itself likely changed much of the biodynamic structure that they were likely to organize movement with. Next, I was subjecting them to tasks that they were not only unfamiliar with, but that I was changing from rep to rep based on what we were trying to accomplish as goals or objectives of our session. And so the activities were chaotic to even a seasoned performer. so all the participants could see basically how I would go about my processes. Thus, I don't personally think we could have done much that would have allowed these two volunteers to perform with what would be deemed by the masses as more efficient biomechanical technique. Additionally, every person who brought up this concern looked at either the start or the end static positions that the athletes were finding themselves in. And I didn't hear a single person bring up issues with the actual dynamics of the patterns. This in and of itself shows the difficulty of breaking down movement and accurately evaluating it if we take a limited viewpoint of the movement pattern itself by only looking at a given position at a respective time scale of the movement execution. In my view, we must look at all contributing factors towards the coordination and control of the movement solution. And again, this biomechanical emphasis was something that was beyond the scope of this given presentation. However, honestly and admittingly, maybe I should have pointed that out while everyone was there so everyone became more aware of it. Finally, and maybe most importantly, the last question that continually was raised to me was, how can these ideas be applied to bigger groups that many of our professionals work with, as opposed to the ways that I was able to modify the activity and the communication that I used to influence movement execution individually? Well, I definitely understand the concern and need for this, because I realize that I personally am in a unique situation and am offered advantageous circumstances that allow me as a professional to have a deeper influence than is realistic for most because of the numbers that they work with. However, this does not mean that there isn't a whole host of things that those who work with larger groups can't or shouldn't do. In fact, there's a good number of things that I hope you can take away from the presentations. Thus, let me offer at least a few practical suggestions. Number one, I would suggest always looking to go beyond a blocked practice schedule. Even the use of a serial practice schedule, where you have the athlete perform a rep of one given activity, then move on to another rep of another activity, and then move on to another yet, and then come back to the original, can pay huge dividends for learning. And the closer you can get to a random practice schedule for the athlete, the more motor learning benefits it can have and will have for the athletes, and this should be a relatively simple change to make for most. It essentially changes the problem, repetition after repetition, and thus requires that athlete to come up with the solution or a new solution again and again. The second thing that I think people in larger groups can employ is the use of more lifelike stimuli. Requiring athletes to react to someone's voice or a point in direction is fine and dandy in, say, agility movement skill. But where we need to get is having them formulate their movement solution based on the flow of perceptual information from human stimuli if their sport requires it. And this is something that everyone can use more of by pairing up athletes with one another and then giving brief instructions to both parties on expected behaviors and how to manipulate the task constraints to cause athletes to solve problems in certain ways. Finally, I believe that we should all, as movement professionals, attempt to change our instructions and our feedback, both in regards to what we say and how we say it, as well as how often we say it and when we go about saying it. Now, if you paid attention during the hands-on session, you will notice that I was attempting to subtly do this and attempting to find a balance between offering explicit knowledge and information and allowing implicit learning to occur. Again, this topic of guidance of an athlete is an all-important one, and one that we couldn't possibly discuss to the depth that it needed to be given the time allotment of the presentations. But just given those three changes to our practice structure can work in larger groups, as it would help for the athlete to gain ownership throughout the movement practice which again should be one of our main goals for most movement sessions. Now, in part one, of course, we discussed some of those key points that I tried to offer that you can use to expand your own learning and your own outlook and understanding of sport movement behavior, namely in regards to motor control and motor learning. Here in this second part, I attempted to address 5 main questions that popped up again and again after the presentations. Now, I'm sure there were many more, and if you do have them, please feel free to reach out to me at Shawn, SHAWN, at OptimizeMovement.com. So for another movement lesson, this has been Shawn Myszka, Movement Mastery and OptimizeMovement.com. I'll talk to you guys on the flip side. Until then, let's continue to master the art of optimizing movement.